back. Brighter Morning with Bo. I'm Bo Tiwari. We're glad that you're on. Our telephone numbers are 609-6283 and 609-6284. You are welcome to call and to make a comment or to ask a question. 609-6283, 609-6284. This is Brighter Morning with Bo, and we are on MCTV, Multicultural TV, and U97.5, Hot Like Pepper, Multicultural Radio. Our next guest is Kriss Marcus, and we'll be talking within the framework of approaching the budget about issues related to budgetary matters. But I just wanted to say that, you know, listening to the clip of looking at the papers today and looking at the clip from the leader of the opposition, in the newspapers today, there is the suggestion by Mr. Kewal Singh from the Police Service Commission that he's not certain whether the matter went to the president or not, and whether the chairman of the Police Service Commission, Ms. Bliss Sipasad, did not in fact give the list to Her Excellency the President. But the leader of the opposition is stating quite clearly and categorically that her information is that the president did receive the list and in fact acknowledged the list, and that the issue is really why did the president, Her Excellency the President, not send the list so that the list could come before the parliament for debate. And those are different. These both facts could not be true. Okay, either the president received the list, acknowledged it, and did not send it to parliament, and she is right, she's correct to question what happened, and or the chairman took the list and did not in fact hand it to the president, but there then could not be an acknowledgement letter from the president if that happened. So I think this is something that we need to clarify. I don't think the leader of the opposition would bring a matter like that into the public without having the facts, and if her facts are correct, then it adds to the controversy that is now raging. And it adds to the what can I say, what seems like a range of complicit parties in all of these. You know, I asked the Minister of National Security when he was here very squarely, has there been any political interference? And he answered indicating no, there was no political interference. I found it a little curious about the movement of information from the National Security Council and the Police Service Commission, and then subsequently the appointment of an investigation committee, of an investigator in the person of retired Justice John, and then the controversy about the appointment, 2 commissioners, 1 commissioner, then the quote-unquote suspension, the commissioner, Mr. Griffith, up to August 17th, not being able to take up office. And that is where everything kind of goes haywire. So, I mean, I think the facts and the sequence of events on these matters are absolutely critical. for the public understanding of what transpired and for the public scrutiny of what is transpiring and what it means. And I think it is absolutely necessary as well for public knowledge. You cannot have a democracy if people do not know what the facts are. And because then you will be discussing all kinds of things without regard to the facts. And facts are very important things when you are discussing issues, especially issues that are likely to become controversial or are controversial. And this has become an extremely controversial matter in the public domain, in the press, and in the courts of law. Okay, we have a caller. Good morning. Good morning. We have a caller? Or the guest? Or we have the guest online now? All right, this is Mr. Kriss Marcus, and we will talk to him. He is in the field of finance, and he is with us this morning, and we'll talk to him. Good morning. How are you?
Good morning, Dr. Tuari. Thank you very much. I'm fine. And good morning to our guests, our
yes,
viewers.
Well, we're glad to have you. We're glad to have, I think from you, we are getting a perspective from a more innovative element of the private sector, and not very, very conventional, and but very, very strategic in terms of where the world is going. And more than that, I think we're getting a young perspective, which is that, you know, there's a traditional way of looking at economics and finance, and there is a conservative way of looking at those things, which, and that is important, but there also is a radical, and I mean that in the real sense of the word, a radical way of looking at finance and economy. And I think you bring that perspective as well. Talk a little bit about the two institutions that you represent here.
Yes, okay, thank you. Okay, I represent Aspire Funds Management.
Yes, okay.
That ultimately is an investment company that is arranging financing for companies that are desirous of private equity.
Okay.
On the other side of things, we have capital
market. Let me get that
straight.
So
sure.
Aspire is a private equity financing company.
Financing vehicle, that's correct.
Right. Okay.
All right. On the capital market side, we have KCL, who does the arrangement of other types of instruments and other types of activities and financing. So we have the arranger on the KCL side of things, and then we have the Aspire, who does the private equity investing and looking at transactions that KCL does, so that we can make decisions in terms of how we can support clients who are desirous of trying to source the right amount of capital as well as the right type of capital. Okay. So the relationship is one where we complement each other while trying to establish partnerships within and outside of the regional environment.
Okay, so you are a Trinidad and Tobago based company, but you are looking at the region, you're looking at the world, and you are in finance and you are into private equity financing. and you are into arranging deals that make those things work. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
All right. Now, we have a budget coming up on October 4th. And generally, what the budget involves in any given year, and I suspect there will be some similarity approach, at least on this question, is that you're going to have revenue, you're going to have expenditure, we will probably have a deficit, and you are going to have fiscal allocations. And that basically, I mean, I'm being simplistic here, but that basically is how the budget will be. And at the end of the day, you'll have a set of fiscal measures that come in the form of a bill that is going to be debated and passed in the parliament. Is this, in your view, an adequate way to proceed with the budget, or do we need to be thinking about something different, and why?
Yes. I'm actually glad that you introduced this particular approach to our national budget for several reasons. I agree with you that an unconventional way of doing things is required. And what we have seen is budgetary planning over the last 6 decades or so around fiscal policy. More importantly and more specifically, fiscal policy that is geared towards our energy sector. In Trinidad and Tobago, we have been crying out for diversification. So what we want to speak to this morning is a movement away from fiscal policy to monetary policy. And this is not being introduced in a vacuum. If we look at what has taken place in the United States and the rest of the world from 2009, 2008, 2009 with the financial crisis, we would have seen international economies move away from fiscal policy, which is government spending and government revenue, more towards monetary policy, which is money supply economics. Money supply economics, put simply, is really creating the enabling environment so there is adequate liquidity for business activities, individual spending, corporate spending, and of course, ensuring that financial conditions are ripe for innovation to be serviced by the right financing and the right financing and the right amount of financing. If we take ourselves back to what has been taking place over the last few years, you will hear more about central bank governors, the Ben Bernanke, the Janet Yellen, the Jerome Powells, the Mario Draghis of this world. And they have already been speaking more about monetary policy and financial conditions being buoyant. What does monetary policy mean in the context of Trinidad and Tobago, taking into consideration what has been done in these international economies? In Trinidad and Tobago, put simply, it is putting more liquidity and more financial resources in the hands of both businesses and individuals. In the case of the businesses, this liquidity will find the innovation that we are looking for will be supported by this liquidity. Industries desirous of doing things differently, growing, especially in the small and medium-sized environment, will ultimately require financing. And if we can create an environment where liquidity conditions are so strong, companies don't necessarily have to be concerned about the cost of borrowing. And in addition to that, if we have liquidity conditions that are favorable for individual spending, we can stimulate economic activity. For the man in the street, it simply means having more disposable income to spend with monetary policy conditions being improved. And of course, for businesses, it's to service that said innovation that we are looking for. Very, very importantly, monetary policy changes in Trinidad and Tobago primarily speak to the non-energy sector. Fiscal policy, if you look at how budgets are planned, it is usually about government revenues, government spending, what we expect from the oil and gas, and how do we plan our budget accordingly. We are saying that the non-energy sector may benefit more from monetary policy changes, which is indirectly a conversation around diversification. So it's very important for us to understand that where we are speaking about ensuring that we now pay more attention to the non-energy sector and the activities and policy decisions that will enable greater activity so they can now contribute to that national conversation of increased foreign exchange earnings.
Okay, now when you talk, when you talk about the big economies like the United States, you talk about Europe and so on, that is one thing. Where basically right now, for instance, the Congress in the United States and ultimately the Senate will have to make a decision on whether to allow the United States, for instance, to default on its debt because it has reached its debt ceiling and that debt ceiling must be raised. And it just underscores the fact that countries that are large like that and industrialized in the way that they are and powerful in its reach in terms of global business, in order to keep their economy going, just keep printing money and they can do whatever is required without constraints. The only constraints here for the U.S. is the legislature. Now, in small economies like ours, you have to manage a limited amount of revenue. We have a situation where most of our revenue came from oil. We are fighting hard as anything to get revenues from other sources. The government itself is limited to revenues from taxes on the energy sector and on business and various taxes that it can impose. So when you talk about monetary policy here, you're talking about the central bank. And we have seen that there is a kind of relationship between the Ministry of Finance and the central bank. I don't know how much freedom the central bank has now on monetary policy. But I understand what you are saying. Trinidad and Tobago has a significant amount of liquidity in the banking sector now, close to $1 billion really. And that if that money were made available at low cost to the private sector on projects that were meaningful, you could have a stimulation of the economy. So what would you require of the central bank here in Trinidad and Tobago, separate and distinct from the fiscal measures in the budget for allocation of funds and deployment of funds for development?
Yes. Now, before I answer that, I want to say that the whole conversation around the central bank and monetary policy cannot be had in a vacuum. There are specific activities such as the introduction of private equity alongside these measures that will ultimately help improve conditions. So to your question with respect to the central bank and the government, there are some simple things that we can look at. So for example, our financial system, the commercial banks primarily are very healthy in terms of capital adequacy. And the central bank over the years has used simple policy tools such as movement of the reserve requirements and interest rate policy to manage liquidity conditions. In Trinidad and Tobago and the rest of the world, we have had a contraction as a result of the pandemic, inactivity, we have seen job losses, etc. So if, let's say, for example, we were to reduce interest rates, benchmark interest rates, the rates that all other interest rates that the average borrower borrows against, we are actually putting more disposable income into the hands of businesses and individuals to spend. Increasing disposable income by reducing interest rates at a point where it is credit conditions are buoyant and can become even more buoyant. The whole idea of stimulus is really what we are trying to get. What do we do to stimulate local spending to support local business activity and commerce in Trinidad and Tobago, so that we put ourselves in a better position in terms of the average consumer, the average business person, the small and medium-sized business enterprises. If the banks can prove to central bank, for example, that they are properly capitalized in terms of capital adequacy, etc., central bank can consider reducing the reserve requirements. Also, central bank has the ability to issue T-bills for liquidity management that typically are taken up by the institutions, large institutions such as commercial banks, insurance companies, pension plans, and typically coming close to maturity as a tool and a measurement, as a tool, these instruments are rolled over. In other words, they are not retired, or they are not repaid on the part of the central bank. They are just rolled over and the maturity is extended.
You don't take
If we were to, if we were to let those instruments mature, just for argument's sake, we have even more liquidity into the system. More liquidity in the system is going to force banks and other financial institutions to want to deploy this capital at a lower cost. A lower cost of capital means lower borrowing costs for businesses, lower borrowing costs for individuals, more disposable income. And we have to remember that in the pandemic, we would have had a fall off in business revenues, loss of jobs. If you are in a position now to increase liquidity conditions so that as businesses reopen or attempt to reopen, they are now in a position where they have to service less debt load while trying to recover revenues at the pre-pandemic levels and even higher, if you have to be as optimistic as possible. So we are speaking about what are the financial conditions in Trinidad and Tobago that we can that are prevailing, and what we can do to improve those financial conditions. Again, for businesses, it is less concern about servicing debts and getting businesses back on track. For the individual, it is being able to spend more money. In simple terms, having chicken to go with your beans and rice.
All right. Now, I know that what you are saying there could be very complex for people who are listening or viewing to appreciate and understand and contextualize. But let me raise two issues with you. Even before COVID, we had a situation of strong liquidity, high liquidity in the banks. But businesses were not borrowing in order to invest. Now, there might be two reasons for that. One would be the high cost of borrowing, but the second reason might be the lack of confidence in the economy for businesses to borrow. So that is one set of problems that have very little to do with COVID. Now, we've had this COVID experience, and in this COVID experience, we've had a lot of businesses collapsing. The figure of 6,000 businesses going out of business has been mentioned. The government has objected to that number, saying that it's less. But in the absence of real statistics, it's hard for us to say. So let us say a fair number of businesses are going to collapse. And you have this liquidity in the bank. And we've got to get the economy going, because if businesses have collapsed, people have lost their jobs. And if businesses have been limited in their opening, people have lost their jobs. And if you have a situation in which businesses are under pressure and people are under pressure, you can neither stimulate consumer demand, nor can you expect businesses to recover and get back on their feet. Now, take these two things that I mentioned to you, the pre-COVID situation having to do with high liquidity but seemingly low confidence to invest, and the current situation where investment is and rehabilitation of business is at a premium. You still have the high liquidity. How should we proceed? What are you saying that we should do to proceed?
Leading up to the pandemic and where we are today, Trinidad and Tobago's financial system has been primarily a debt market, lendings and borrowings, to your point, to your original point. And the reality of it is that debt is time bound. We could have had the right amount of debt and a company was able to access debt or service debt. But if for some reason or the other those businesses haven't accessed that debt, were unable to fulfill what they needed to do while that debt obligation was put in place, we still have the debt obligation, and it may mean a refinancing, a restructuring of its obligations. And in Trinidad and Tobago, because we have been primarily a debt market, we basically have a lender's relationship in Trinidad and Tobago as opposed to an investor's relationship. You spoke a while ago about investor confidence and local investor confidence, but at the same time, we are lenders to ourselves. We are not investors to ourselves. So we have a situation where it is we are seeking to get investor confidence, both on the local and the international side, but we don't have local confidence. So in other words, we are trying to sell our home to someone else, saying it is haunted. You could buy it, but it's not good enough for me, simply because we have not demonstrated local confidence. Now that statement should not be taken in a vacuum. The absence of other means of financing is really what we're speaking to and what we're driving at. And this is where I want to introduce the issue of private equity. Patient capital versus impatient capital. Patient capital, private equity, which is the right amount of capital, but capital that is prepared to wait for businesses to recover, versus impatient capital. I'm not saying impatient in the dictionary meaning. I'm saying impatient to the extent that debt is time bound. There's always a maturity date for a loan to be repaid, and whether or not a company or an individual accesses debt.
Yeah, well, let me stop you there because it's important to clarify that. You're talking about a debt market in which the relationship between business and, let's say, the banking and the rest of the financial sector is one in which you approach the lender for debt. They lend you after they are sure that their debt is secure, their loan is secure. You are then on your own and you have to repay. If you get into trouble with the repayment, well, then they would do whatever is required, foreclose or whatever. And you are talking about something else, which is private equity, which you describe as patient capital, in which you are prepared to work with the business and help the business along and wait for it to recover and become viable and sustainable. And it's only with that patient partnership approach that you see value accruing both for the business and for the equity partner. Is that correct?
This is correct. In fact,
you are not competing with the banks. You are bringing an additional value with a completely different approach to complement what the banks do.
This is true. With private equity, it's the same check that is being written in terms of the amount. The difference with private equity is that private equity investors now become minority owners of those businesses, shareholders of those businesses. Now, private equity investment companies like ourselves have no desire to take control of a business.
Yeah,
We
because
see
that's not your
businesses,
business. Yes, of
that's
course.
not our business.
Yeah.
We see businesses that have value, very strong outlooks. And in those circumstances, we want to invest in your expertise. However, we want to show you how to run your business better, how to make you a good company, a great company. The private equity, in terms of the financial impact, is to bring down your debt because you are now replacing loans with shares. We own piece of the share, we own some of the shares in your company because that represents our investment. But with that share investment comes expertise associated with what we do as financial institutions. So, for example, we would look at a business, see what is taking place in terms of the areas of corporate governance, compliance. And the word compliance is multi-dimensional. Compliance in terms of doing the right things internally, but also doing the right things as far as our regulators are concerned. Tax compliance,
Corporate citizenship. Yeah.
corporate citizenship. We have been speaking about the issues about tax, revenue, leakage, whichever one you want to call it. But the reality of it is that we have the opportunity to get companies to do the right thing, both in terms of what is right from a contribution to government revenues, but also to ready themselves for a bigger conversation, a better and a brighter reality. In Trinidad and Tobago, in the budget read last year, for example, the Minister of Finance put forward some incentives for small and medium-sized businesses to go on the junior stock exchange. The silent part of that conversation is how do we move from a company being qualifying to become, to find itself on the stock exchange, having identified that this is definitely a need. Private equity is the step and the nexus between a company putting up its hand saying it wants private equity to go to, it wants to go to the stock market because of the outlook and what we believe this company can do. A private equity investment company, as well as our business partners, will go inside of there, look at the business, put all the necessary corporate governance and compliance infrastructure, financial controls, strategic management, human resource management in place, and then prepare this company to go public. Now, there are incentives for going public for small and medium-sized businesses. I want to make a quick reference to our counterparts in Jamaica, who also have taken the view that investment now is required equally as important. Equity investment is equally as important as debt investment. So the Jamaicans, for example, they have a small and medium-sized or junior stock exchange as we do. They have 40 companies listed. We have 3. In the United States, to give you more context in terms of how private equity works, in the United States, the pension plan industry represents private equity, represents 40% of the pension plan industry in the United States. United States has 6,700 private equity firms. So the value of indigenous investment in indigenous assets is typified and characterized by the high prevalence of these businesses or these private equity firms. So Jamaica has been able to use private equity to populate its stock exchange. We are saying that we have an international example in the United States. We have a regional example in our brothers in Jamaica, our brothers and sisters in Jamaica. And of course, just by the way, the information that I got here in terms of the Jamaican reality is via one of our business partners who we have sought to do private equity arrangement with as a means of bringing the awareness of this particular type of financing to Trinidad and Tobago. And of course, bringing down what they refer to as deleveraging of Trinidad and Tobago's businesses. It's a huge opportunity because when we take into consideration the point that you made earlier on about the 6,000 or so businesses closing, if private equity was available prior to their closure, it would mean less preoccupation on being able to service debt. And many of these businesses have found themselves in a situation where it is as a result of their inability to service debt, they have had to close. Debt and landlord obligations, not being able to pay salaries, etc. The good news is that if private equity was to be introduced right now into the national conversation around the budget and what we do in the private sector for private businesses, and I say private sector, financial services private sector, if we could, with the right structures, arrange private equity for these businesses, there will be several key positives. Number one, a reintroduction of businesses that had to close their doors, a reintroduction of jobs that had been lost. Now we know we have always been speaking about job creation, but the pandemic has created a situation where we have had job loss. So we need to speak to job recreation, then getting these businesses back on track so they are no longer preoccupied with servicing debt, but more focusing on getting these businesses, focusing on businesses being businesses and focusing on those activities to make those companies good. Again, with the compliance dimension, with the climate compliance and what we call the human capital, the intellectual capital that comes with a private equity engagement and investment, you now will get that compliance culture embedded into that business. So you're going to have the tax revenues coming into government. And of course, the incentive to go into to the stock exchange will be similar, we will now be able to recognize and realize those benefits and the incentives put forward. In Jamaica, for example, for the first 5 years, a new company going onto the stock exchange pays no taxes, and for the second 5 years, 50% in taxes. Similar incentives or similar framework was recommended last year by the Minister of Finance, and I'm saying that if you were to introduce this year the dimension of the private equity component to link the small and medium-sized incentives to go to the stock exchange and going to the stock exchange, I think we'll be doing more of the right things as opposed to otherwise.
Okay, well, you've said quite a bit there, but you are saying basically private equity financing could save a lot of businesses that would ordinarily collapse because of the COVID. That's the first thing. Private sector financing could create the conditions in which the businesses are more viable in terms of business strategy, business competitiveness, but also compliance with the laws. So all these problems of NIS and not filing taxes and so on would be solved that the Minister of Finance talks about. But more than that, you are saying you can now prepare the ground for the flow of a number of businesses into the stock market, the stock exchange, so that you stimulate the stock exchange as well, and you also stimulate the consumer market for investment in the stock exchange. People, ordinary people, workers, and other people who want to invest in these businesses. And there's a general good movement strategy all around of stimulating the national economy and causing a recovery in both jobs, revenue for businesses, profits for business, and the flourishing of the commercial market. Am I correct?
This is true. In fact, I want to continue what you're saying and by saying this. We need to start speaking about wealth creation for the man in the streets and for Trinidad and Tobago. In the absence of owning your own business, wealth creation can be derived from owning a piece of a business. Owning a piece of a business is exactly what you're describing, investing in the stock market. Over the years, institutions and individuals have participated in the senior stock exchange, 31 or so companies. And when you take into consideration these being the core and only players for some time, companies and individuals may be up to their limits with existing opportunities on the senior stock exchange. By populating the junior stock exchange with very strong but smaller businesses, we are giving these companies the opportunity to grow while we grow with them in terms of wealth creation. Not enough is being spoken about in our society these days about wealth creation for everyone. The UTC initiative was one of the most important decisions that we could have made in our country's history because it puts wealth creation opportunities into the hands of the average citizen. We are saying now that with growing levels of financial awareness and sophistication, as we would invest in one of the bigger companies that we all know, we are now putting ourselves in a position to invest in smaller companies. As we drive through our streets on a daily basis, we see businesses that have been around for a long time. They are of a certain size, but they have been there and they've been doing good business. If we had an opportunity to invest in these businesses, assuming, of course, if the shareholders and owners are open to divesting part of their business and putting it on the stock exchange, of course, with the introduction of private equity, it's a good story for them and for us would-be investors. In addition to that, private equity also gives companies the opportunity to remedy what has taken place on their balance sheet by bringing down debt to ensure that the companies, what they refer to as a capital structure, is a good one, which will enable more debt by banks because banks are far more comfortable that the company is not what they call over leveraged or has too much debt on its books. Bringing down the leverage of a company via private equity, putting in the expertise, and us in the financial services sector collaborating with each other to find ways of making these businesses better to go. And if they decide to go public, they can go public. Some companies may say, something, we're happy as we are. And some companies may say, something. I believe, based on my industry experience and our business relationships, there's this company who may like my company more than me at a particular point in time. It may be an acquisition opportunity. Mergers and acquisitions happen every day, every minute in the international community. So again, it's really us moving away from a culture of only lending. Lending has a very, very important place, and we are not saying to replace lending with equity. We need both of them. But with the financial services sector and private sector putting up its hands to say, we are here to help and we want to do these things, because every economy in the globe has been given an opportunity to reset and reboot, to look at what our challenges and opportunities are, and to capitalize upon them, getting the opportunity to do the right thing the right way. Everybody understands that we have had economic contraction, social displacement, and the like as a result of the pandemic. How do we respond will ultimately determine how history records us as a society in terms of how do we take the view of continuing to just lend to ourselves, or do we start investing in ourselves? Do we see ourselves as an asset worth investing in? Do we see ourselves as a potentially competitive society going forward? Are we going to continue to rely on the traditional sources of foreign exchange to carry us forward?
The points that you are making, they are very important. I think what you are saying is that COVID has created a watershed that we now have to take advantage of. We can't just go about our business in the same way. Secondly, we cannot finance our businesses in the same way. And we cannot finance our businesses on the basis of debt accumulation only. There is therefore a great opportunity now for private equity financing, and this could change the game. Now, we only have about 3 minutes, and you have to answer these two questions I'm going to ask you very, very succinctly, very pointedly. The first thing is that these businesses, to help them recover and to have them simply involved in retail in the local market is a waste of time. They're not going anywhere. So the question is, how do you transform, how do you use equity participation to transform, not only get them up to scratch and make them competitive, but to get them to transform, get them to diversify their export markets, get them to export more, and therefore effect a transformation of local business so that we become foreign exchange earners?
Okay. In my thoughts on this particular matter, I came up with something that I'd like to call the seven-sector economic model, where we divide our economy up into seven sectors. We know about energy, we have agriculture, all forms of tourism, the arts and multiculturalism, manufacturing and distribution. Each of these sectors have an owner. The energy sector, either by default or design, is owned by the government. All right? All these other sectors have owners, larger players, not so large players, who belong to this particular sector. If you were to look at our economy as a series of divisions, where we have sectoral division owners who are seeking to attract foreign exchange in all currencies, what are these sectoral owners doing to become internationally competitive? Let's assume we get the private equity and we get the support of the financial institutions. Let's assume that we do all that we have to do in terms of laying the foundation for these businesses right now. These sector owners now have to find themselves in a position where they want to become competitive so they can monetize their goods and services internationally, so we can now attract foreign exchange so they can contribute to the other sectoral owners. Notice for our entire discussion, I have not raised the issue of government and what the government must do. This is a conversation outside of the non-energy sector and a private sector conversation. Yes. Diversification and innovation is a private sector and a private individual activity.
All right, very good. Now, I want to close by summarizing, and you could just make a little comment afterwards, what you are saying. You're saying that, look, fiscal policy must drive government expenditure. We understand that. And fiscal incentives by the government must stimulate private sector activity. We understand that. But more key than all of this is monetary policy, which make finance available in opportunities more than debt, and takes into the reality of equity financing, private equity financing, so that businesses can grow, compete, develop, expand, export. And that exactly will be correct. Good for the country, it will be good for jobs, it will be good for private sector growth, it will be good for less government in the economy, etc. It will grow the private sector, we can stimulate the stock market, and we really need to be thinking like that in order to make these things happen. Can I let you conclude the discussion this morning then?
Yes, I will say to add and conclude to what we've been discussing this morning. If you look at the successful businesses right across Trinidad and Tobago, they have not relied on government policy to do what they need to do to be the best product and service. It is going to be left up to us, the population. John F. Kennedy in 1961 said, ask not what you can do for your country, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. 1 year before independence. And we are at that point where we need to say, we need to step up and work alongside government. And government is very, very anonymous in terms of it doesn't matter which government. At the end of the day, we are speaking about the population stepping forward, the private sector stepping forward and supporting government in the non-energy sector activities.
Okay, so your approach is a blueprint really for private sector liberation and high performance.
This is correct.
All right, thank you very much, Kriss, for this conversation this morning and adding a different dimension to our approach to the budget of 2022, due to be read on October 4th. Thank you
And
very
I
much for
thank you
listening and
too.
what.
I thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for listening and watching. This is Brighter Morning with Bo, and I am Bo Tiwari signing off this morning and passing on to Chanel with the news.